Hello everyone, my name's Philip Newell. I'm a lecturer here at the University of Bristol, and I'm really honoured to be your chair for this last session. Just this day, the Bristol Hub colloquiums, they really show everything that I love about gambling as a discipline. You know, you have so many different, it's so interdisciplinary. You have so many different approaches, so many different perspectives. And so many important topics. And every day's a school day when you're in this discipline. You're always learning something new. You're always learning about these different contexts, say, the new things about youth gambling or gambling in Africa. And despite that novelty, I guess, for me as a researcher, I always try and think, what are the similarities between this new context and the things that I have already learned about my discipline. So hopefully this is going to be a really interesting last session for us to end on. The session is all about global perspectives on intervention on gambling harms, which is hopefully just a really interesting last session for us to end on. Because for me personally, trying to help prevent gambling harms, that's really why I got into this research area. And it's definitely one where we're going to need a lot of collaboration between different perspectives to make genuine progress. We are definitely making progress here in the UK, but a metaphor that I've used before is whack-a-mole. We're moving quite slowly as research and policy, and yet the industry is innovating really quickly. So hopefully we're going to have a good debate today, just in this final session. I'm delighted that we're going to be starting off with our keynote, Jeff Derevensky, who's come over all the way from Canada. He's a really eminent researcher in the space. He's got a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different topics that he's researched over his career. I think the number that I have here is 350 peer-reviewed journal articles, which is just absolutely astounding. So Jeff, I'm going to welcome you to the stage now to talk about global perspectives on intervention.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Philip, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me here to share with you some of the work we've been doing and what has been happening globally on an international level. Very excited to see all the young researchers here. Gives me great satisfaction that some of us old-timers can kind of fade off into the sunset and you'll take over. The posters outside were amazing. And I strongly encourage all of you to continue in this field. It's a great field. It's a very collaborative field. It's one of the most collaborative fields in psychology that I've been involved in during my long career now. I also want to basically say I think it's really important to see all the interdisciplinary people here from different areas, places that I've never even thought about. For example, last night there was a presentation about music and how that relates to gambling. And so I think it's really important for all of us to come together to try to answer some of the pressing questions. We know that gambling is normalized in our society. This is not just here in the UK, but it's also throughout the world. More and more young people are getting involved in gambling. We heard sessions just previously where a young man started when he was 9 years of age. This is not atypical. It is not atypical for parents to be gambling with their children or to allowing their children to gamble. So I think it's really important to address this. I have a lot of slides, and because of your technology, not mine, you're able to pull my slides down. I won't be able to go through all the slides, but I added slides to give you more reference material so that you'll have that should you want that. For any of you who would like to contact us, you can contact us at youthgambling.com. You could see all those 350-odd publications that I have, plus many of the prevention, intervention tools that we've developed over the years. And what I want to suggest is that and we've talked about this many times, that gambling is amongst the fastest growing industries worldwide. The amounts of money that are being wagered are enormous. Last night we heard that the GDP, gambling revenues exceed the GDP of 86% of countries worldwide. We know the vast majority of people are gambling, and most of those people are not experiencing many gambling-related harms. This conference is focused on the gambling-related harms. But the reality is that most people will gamble and gamble in a relatively safe way. Sometimes they slip and make a mistake. They overexpend, they spend too much money, and then they will come back and say, you know what, let me self-correct, and I will try to do this in a more responsible way. We also heard from the last session that gambling not only affects 1 to 3% of adults, but all those other people who are affiliated and associated with those people. So if I once attended a session with gambling operators, and they said, Jeff, what's the big deal if only 1% or 2% of adults have a gambling problem? Well, those 1 to 2% impact 7 to 10 other people. So now multiply that 1 to 2% times 7 or 10, and now we come up with a substantial number. We know that the prevalence rates of young people are actually higher than that of adults in terms of gambling-related problems. And that's really important for us to see going forward. We also know that gambling has changed dramatically. We've heard about online gambling. We've heard about AI as a tool that gambling operators are using to attract people, or possibly using AI as a tool to actually identify people at an earlier age or at an earlier stage of their gambling. But I want to raise one other important issue related to that, and that is we can identify problem gamblers, but how do we change their behavior? That becomes critical. I had a young man in my office, we do treatment as well. On one of the walls I had a list of what's referred to as the DSM-4 MRJ, which was developed by Sue Fisher at the University of Plymouth. And it says if you endorse 4 or more of these items, you may have a gambling problem. And I had a young man sitting there in my office telling me, I endorse all those items. I don't think I have a gambling problem. My girlfriend thinks I have a gambling problem. My parents think I have a gambling problem, but I don't have a gambling problem. So that becomes the challenge for many of us in terms of trying to intervene once an individual has been identified as having a gambling problem. We talked about the widespread advertising. Raffaello's done some tremendous work in this area, and from a worldwide perspective. And how are we going to intervene? Can we modify things? Are we going to impact social policy? We know that there's a general lack of community involvement and awareness amongst gambling, especially amongst parents. We haven't discussed parents here, but when we discuss young children's gambling behavior, we have to look at parents as well. I had a young man in my office one day. One of the things we tried to do is get the parents involved. He was 17 years old. He said, okay, Jeff, you could bring in my parents, but do me a favor and don't tell them how severe my gambling problem is. So I bring his parents in and I say, I have to tell you that your son has a gambling problem. And they said, thank God, I thought it was something bad like alcohol or drugs. So that tells us right from the beginning that most people do not view gambling as a very serious problem. We all have these stereotypes of what the problem gambler looks like. And one of the things we have to do is really try to modify that. We know that the UK Gambling Commission has attempted to look at gambling-related harms. This is just one area that they've addressed. We've worked with the UK Gambling Commission around youth gambling over the years. And there's whole models that you could look at from a gambling harm prevention perspective. One of the things that Ali talked about is meeting kids where they are. Well, one of the things, we need to develop more gambling prevention programs that are responsive to their needs from where their perspective is. We know that there are a number of current prevention strategies in terms of public awareness and Problem Gambling Awareness Month. For example, we have enhanced gambling regulations. It may not be going that far. One of the things Philip and I talked about last night was whether or not our research is really impacting policy. Well, I have to say that when I first started many, many years ago, for those of you who know about Star Wars, I was viewed as Darth Vader, the enemy. But in reality, I'm just this little Yoda guy who tries to help work with the industry to try to modify their behavior, to try to work with regulators in terms of trying to show how research can influence and minimize the harms that are associated with gambling and for which individuals they are, and looking at highly vulnerable populations. We know that there are other areas such as reduction of supply, limiting venue hours, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these are worldwide strategies which have been generally aimed at the general population. Having said that, many of them don't have empirical support. So one of the things that's really necessary for us is to really provide whether or not those regulations that are being developed based upon research are using appropriate research. One of the other things that's important, I just read a doctoral dissertation recently where they interviewed the industry, and the industry was saying, you know what, researchers are not answering the questions we need to know. So one of the things I think we have to do is we also have to listen to the industry, regulators, and government saying, what questions do you need to know the answers to? And that becomes really, really important. We know we could look at common risk factors. This is not a comprehensive list, but it just gives you some ideas about some of the risk factors that are involved in gambling. Problem gamblers are not a homogeneous group. They don't just differ in terms of gender, but they differ in terms of a wide variety of characteristics. And targeting programs, harm reduction, harm minimization programs for one group may not be necessarily all that effective for another group. We're developing a program right now in the state of Massachusetts in the US around sports wagering, trying to educate young kids about sports wagering. This was sponsored, or is being sponsored, by the Attorney General's office in the state of Massachusetts. And one of the things they wanted to develop was a program that was good for children from 10 to 21 years of age. Well, a 10-year-old can't comprehend the same way as a 21-year-old. So we really need to develop different kinds of strategies and different types of programs. Here are some, again, general prevention, intervention strategies aimed at problem or at-risk gamblers. We know that self-exclusion programs are the most popular in terms of either online gambling or in land-based venues. Who uses these self-exclusion programs, and are they effective? We know from a lot of longitudinal research that's been done in Canada that problem gamblers will actually regress and not necessarily be problem gamblers their entire life. They may go back to what we refer to as social or recreational gambling. And then eventually they may actually go forward and become problem gamblers again. Unlike what we heard earlier, where there was a natural progression from a young person to an adult, where the gambling problems remain constant, we know that there's a fluctuation in terms of gambling. We also know that the prevalence rates of adults are much lower than of young people. Well, why is that? Is that because all the young people are going for treatment? We know that they don't go for treatment. There's a lot of work that's been done on self-recovery, and we have to understand more about what's going on in order to develop our treatment programs more effectively. We have things like posting of odds. We work with young kids, and kids don't really care about odds. They think they're smarter than everyone else. They can actually win. I was sitting in a casino last week in Las Vegas, and they asked me, "Do you gamble?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Well, why don't you gamble, Jeff?" I said, "Look at this building that costs $2 billion. Who's smarter, me or them?" But everybody in that casino gambling thinks they're smarter than the owner. And whether or not you're doing online gambling or you're doing land-based gambling, I think it's really important to look at. We know that there's work that's being done on helplines. One of the things that we've been doing is working on the Florida helpline and analyzing individuals who call a helpline, whether they be the gambler himself or herself, or whether it be the spouse or parent of a gambler. We know there are pop-up messages. Sally Gainsbury, I don't know, Sally's here, there she is. Sally's done a lot of work on pop-up messages. Do they work? And for whom do they work? So I have 1 minute. I don't have to read all these things to you. They're all here. You'll be able to go online and pull all this information. But I wanted to also give you some other references that you might want to look at going forward in terms of understanding as to how we can minimize harms. Again, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, giving me an opportunity to share some of our work. If any of you are interested, please feel free to go on www.youthgambling.com, and you'll see some of the work that we have done and are developing right now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much to Yoda for that very informative presentation. I'm going to be telling Mum all about how I shared a stage with a very important Jedi just later today. So we're going to carry on now with the panelists today. So our first panelist who's speaking is Nikki Bond from the Gambling Harms Action Lab, which is a really interesting group sort of trying to get unique stakeholders together in the room to see what can be done about gambling harms. Nikki, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Philip. So I'll explain to you what the Gambling Harms Action Lab is, but before I do, I'm going to take you a little bit further back about the organisation that I actually come from. So I work for the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute, which is a research and policy charity set up by Martin Lewis in 2016 to break the links between mental health problems and financial difficulties. When we launched in 2016, we did a huge survey of 5,500 people with lived experience of mental health problems and really looked at all of the ways in which their mental health interacted with their finances. And one of the themes that came out of that quite early on was around how gambling was a factor in both their mental health and their finances. And go forward a couple of year or so, we began to think about what solutions sat in this space. We occupy a really unique space in this area in that we sit at the intersection between financial services and financial regulation and mental health problems. And we really thought about what can banks do in this space to support people. And at that time, we made a recommendation for bank gambling blocks, which Monzo and Starling were the first banks to roll out in 2018, and the rest of the sector followed suit. And we're now at a point where most UK banks have bank gambling blocks. But since that time, there's been action that's taken place, but it's taken place in silos, and the learning isn't being shared across the sector. So we thought, how can we intervene in this space? How can we use the knowledge we have, the experience that we continually hear from our research community, and how can we contribute to move this on? So we continue to do some research during COVID and about the experiences and about advertising. And during that, we noted that in the case of online gambling, contrary to kind of what often is touted, that only the operator and the person concerned who's experiencing gambling harms know about gambling. Actually, that's not the case. Financial services also know. They know from every transaction that you make, when you're gambling, how you're gambling, whether you're gambling before you pay your bills or your mortgage or your electricity each month. And we thought, how can we intervene here to try and support people to prevent gambling harms? Which is how the Gambling Harms Action Lab came about. So back in May last year, we were given funding through regulatory settlement from the Gambling Commission to set up what is now the Gambling Harms Action Lab, where we've pulled together 7 current account providers to test and innovate new solutions to supporting people experiencing or at risk of gambling harms. So within that, we have Barclays, HSBC, Nationwide, Virgin Money, Starling, Monzo, and of course, Nationwide. And all of those 7 firms have committed to work with us over an 18-month period to develop those new or improved tools. So this is really about building on the interventions that are out there, because a lot of the conversations today have focused on regulation, they've focused on interventions from gambling operators, and really we thought, how do we utilise this lens that financial services firms have? And there's a golden opportunity in this space. So in 2023, Sue Turner already referenced it, but the Consumer Duty came out from the Financial Conduct Authority, which required financial services firms to prevent foreseeable harm. And so out of that comes where you have transaction data, you can see what people are spending, you can see their behavioural patterns. How can you usefully use that to intervene with people at risk? And I think some of our interventions that we're working with across the lab are not necessarily at the acute end of the scale, so people who are experiencing problem gambling. We know that people in that space, that tools from your banks may support you, but they're not going to be the whole solution. But there's a space in the middle around prevention where financial services can identify people at risk of harm and offer them tools, supportive tools, and signposting to help them. So some of the things we're working on in the lab, I'll talk very briefly about it because Emma's going to go into it a little bit more detail, but things around spending insights and spending limits. So as we know, people who are gambling are notoriously don't estimate how much they're spending on gambling accurately. So can banks provide us with spending insights that keep us updated and have a more accurate understanding of quite how much we're spending? And then can banks offer us spending limits? So, and those personalised bespoke spending limits too. So things like I might be able to set, I only want to spend £30 a week on gambling, or I only want to spend £20 a month on gambling, whatever works for you that allows you to do, as Jeff talked about, those self-correcting tools earlier on before harm really takes hold. So there's some tools around that. There's also issues around gambling in overdrafts that we're looking at with firms. So back in 2020, there was a ban that came in on gambling on credit cards, but there's still gambling persists on another form of credit in overdrafts. And there's a misalignment there in expectations and that we continue to allow on one form of credit but not another. So there's opportunities for intervention there. But I also think the really exciting piece is that data piece that we've been talking about today, and around how banks utilise and understand that data to identify those people who are experiencing harm. So what can they do with that data that they have at their fingertips? How can they communicate with people who may be at risk of or experiencing harms? So one of the things that we're doing in the lab is looking at those and exploring those options. And I think the beauty of the Action Lab is that we're bringing together those 7 firms into what's traditionally a competitive area, but in vulnerability, there's a real need to collaborate and learn from one another. And they're bringing them together in this space where over an 18-month period, they're meeting at 6 weekly intervals to really identify the common challenges that they face in supporting people at risk of or experiencing gambling harms. And then they've committed to conceptualising and designing a solution and then piloting that solution. So what we're hoping to have at the end of the 18-month period is a tried and tested suite of tools that we can then share with the rest of the sector. There will be some mistakes along the way, there will be some successes, but we'll share those learnings so the rest of the sector can begin to raise their bar. And this isn't being built in isolation. So Money and Mental Health, we are founded on our research community of 5,000 people with lived experience of mental health problems. And we have a subgroup of those who have experience of gambling and gambling harms. So we're going out to those on a monthly basis, asking about their experiences and really testing these new tools that financial services have in place. So that these things aren't being made in isolation. That we want to understand that these work for the people that they're intended to serve, and that people would respond to them. That they'll be effective, and then there'll be an evaluation piece at the end. So that's the Gambling Harms Action Lab in a nutshell. Really trying to just work in a different way with a different group of people who have a different lens of gambling harms to what operators have. And it's about how we utilise that lens and how we can maximise that opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nikki. That's a really interesting initiative. I'm really looking forward to seeing the outcomes of the new things that all the banks are trying. I guess what I would just add as a researcher is I really hope you're able to evidence those trials in the most rigorous way possible, so that that evidence can inform the even broader community of international stakeholders. Yeah. Without further ado, we're going to move on to our next panelist, who's Emma Ingram. She's also affiliated with the Gambling Harms Action Lab, but coming to us from a nationwide building society perspective. Emma, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I feel like Nikki and I are very much a double act today. We've had breakfast together, we've been sat today together all day. So yeah, nice to meet you all. I am Emma and I'm a manager in the customer vulnerability team at Nationwide Building Society, one of the largest building society in the UK. My background also is in research psychology, so I've loved being here, seeing the posters and reading kind of the insights today. I think it's been touched on in pretty much every presentation, but gambling-related harm is not a niche topic. It's a growing public health issue, and it touches every corner of our society. It doesn't affect just finances, but it affects mental health, relationships, the ability to live with stability for so many. And for so many, the first signs of that distress show up not in a clinic or a conversation, but actually in a bank statement. And so that is one of the reasons why Nationwide were the first firm to sign up to the Gambling Harms Action Lab and why we're so passionately a part of that today. As financial service providers, we're really uniquely placed to spot early signals. We see the patterns, so frequent deposits to gambling operators, late night transactions, gambling with borrowed funds, overdrafts, as Nikki mentioned. And to us, they aren't just numbers, but they're stories of people who could potentially be at risk. We have, obviously, as been mentioned before as well, consumer duty, which is our regulatory requirement to meet that and to avoid foreseeable harm. But at Nationwide, our purpose is really clear. Don't know if anyone banks with Nationwide in here. I won't test you and ask you to put your hands up. But our purpose is banking, but fairer, more rewarding, and for the good of society. And when you break that down, what that means is it's not just a slogan we use, it's not just something we say, but it's what we really mean in how we operate, how we design and develop our services for our members, and how we respond to vulnerability. So gambling harm being a societal issue, we're really able to play a kind of powerful role, and we are not, as probably all of us can allude to, we're not the only player on this pitch, but we're absolutely one that can support. So we look at doing that through offering tools, collaborating across sectors such as through this work, and making banking safer and also fairer. And I've called out here a few ways we do that. So pulling the word fairer from our purpose means recognising when customers are at risk and designing services that protect them. So things like gambling blocks, spending insights, and proactive outreach. More rewarding, helping people regain control, rebuilding financial resilience, and accessing support without stigma. And I think that stigma piece is a massive one, I'm sure we'll all agree. and for the good of society, which means going beyond compliance. So we can speak about consumer duty and regulation, but actually as a building society and our purpose being fully customer-centric, we are wanting to push beyond compliance and look at how can we really support customers, particularly those who are at risk of harm, to meet their financial needs and improve their holistic well-being. So it's about using our data, using our reach and empathy to support those who may be at risk or experiencing gambling-related harm. In saying that, banks must take a proportionate approach. So we hear sometimes reference the Big Brother approach. So people being nervous about their banks being Big Brother and looking at their statements and looking at how they spend their money. So we have to recognise that gambling is a legitimate activity. It's legal in the UK. And so there's quite a lot of people, a lot of our customers that we see that enjoy gambling and they gamble safely within their means. So we want to make sure that they can still access the products and services whilst gambling recreationally, but also that we protect the most vulnerable through a range of features. So I think Nikki mentioned there around harm prevention features, so budgeting tools, spending limits that are useful for everyone, not just for people who gamble, not just for those at risk of harm, but actually just general in managing your money, and that is what we are looking to do. As well as then focusing on how do we add friction into journeys to support those who maybe are at risk or we can see are gambling, to restrict access to further lending where that is appropriate. So it's a real balancing act that we have to play as a financial services firm. We don't always get it right, and that's why being part of the Gambling Harms Action Lab and learning through others is so important to us to see where are people showing good or firms showing good practice and how can we learn from that. I'd like to just reference a few positive steps that Nationwide's implemented so far. Firstly, probably if we take back, I've been in my role 2 years, but I've been at Nationwide for 6. And I think when I joined Nationwide, there wouldn't have been someone leading on gambling harm prevention. My other hat I wear is in supporting customers with mental health problems. So that in itself is a big step change that finance has seen, where we are now really open to these conversations, and we see this as part of our overall customer strategy rather than something as an aside. Vulnerability is absolutely embedded within our culture. So we have gambling blocks that are available on all of our channels, and those have a 72-hour cooling off period, and we've seen some great success there. We've got frontline training for all of our staff, helping colleagues to identify and respond to signs of harm. And we recently did a really powerful video with Ipsos, which showed lived experience research and insight, and we shared that with all of frontline. We offer warm handoffs to specialist teams and to GamCare, and we have those product controls. So why we joined the Gambling Harms Action Lab, we wanted to deepen our commitment to protecting vulnerable customers and to help shape that sector-wide response to gambling harm. So it provides us with a really unique platform to collaborate across industry to develop those tools and interventions. And something I was mentioning in a conversation earlier is you don't choose your bank based on what gambling support they offer. So actually, it's really important to have that consistency across firms because a lot of people are multi-banked. Probably most people are multi-banked. And so by having that consistency across different current account providers, we can really make sure that we have that support in place wherever and whoever you bank with. And driving some of that innovation in light of consumer duty as well. So we've been able to accelerate our progress, and just in the last minute, I'll touch on some examples of what we've done so far. So we've been using transactional data to identify different risk tiers in our customer base, and now we're looking at operationalizing that. So how do we communicate with those customers? What do we do with that data? And challenging our thinking on what should we be focusing on? What does all this wealth of insight and research from customers tell us that they need from their financial services? And how do we make sure we're targeting the right things? We've tested, or we're in the middle of testing content with people with lived experience of gambling-related harm to make sure that those messages are doing what they should be doing and driving the right levels of support. And we've also supported press releases with Gamble Aware, so really amplifying our external voice to show that Nationwide are really determined to support in this space. I know my time is up, but we're really thrilled to be part of the Gambling Harms Action Lab. We're really excited about the outputs of it, and we know that that will help us to translate, kind of bridge that gap between translating what we see through all these insights and the research into really tangible, actionable benefits for our customers and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you. We will, as the last panelist, be returning to the world of academia with Professor Helen Simpson. And like any good academic, Helen has prepared some slides.
Spectacularly boring
Helen,
slides.
over to you.
Thank you. So yes, I have prepared some very dull slides. So my background is not in gambling. My background is as an economist. And so I think I was asked here today to talk about some issues from a slightly different perspective. And I thought I'd talk about taxation because there's been quite a lot of talk about regulation and other prevention mechanisms throughout the day. So I am going to give a talk that's a little bit sort of economics 201, I'll say. So we're going to start off with reasons why governments tax. The most obvious one being raising revenue in order to fund public services. And myself as an economist, I'd be thinking about optimal ways of doing that without introducing distortions that we don't want. So we don't want incentives to stop people wanting to work or save or things that we think are beneficial. We tax in order to redistribute. We do that either through the public spending that we do through using the tax revenue, or we do it directly through the tax system itself, which we design to be progressive in order so that high income or high wealth individuals are bearing a higher share of the tax burden than low income or low wealth individuals. The thing I really want to focus on today is using tax to change behaviour. So we do that with regard to a number of products which we think generate negative impacts. So either negative impacts on the person who is directly purchasing them, so negative impacts that that person doesn't fully take into account when they make that decision. So they don't think about the future health costs upon themselves from drinking or smoking. They're thinking in the moment. Or, as we heard earlier, they create external costs on people other than themselves. So in the context of the talk earlier, I think the number was for every one person directly engaged in gambling activity, it was having a negative impact on 7 other people. So we might think of these as sin taxes, and we might implement them in areas such as driving, smoking, or alcohol consumption. So with regard to driving, we've got fuel duty, which we put VAT on top of. We've got things like congestion charging. With regard to alcohol, we do different tiered tax rates depending on the alcohol content of a drink, and we tax tobacco. I tried to put an image of a fizzy drink at the bottom there. I think I ended up with bubble tea, but bubble tea itself is probably also pretty sugary. So most recently, the government introduced a sugar tax or soft drinks industry levy. This is levied formally, legally, on firms. And again, it's got tiered rates according to the sugar content of the drink, added sugar per 100 millilitres. So what was the effect of this? In a sense, it worked. It reduced sugar consumption via 2 routes. First of all, by firms reformulating the products that they have. So because it's tiered, best thing you can do as a firm is reformulate the sugar content of your product so it's just below one of those tier boundaries. And also through some pass-through of the tax to prices of sugary drinks. There's a couple of things I want to draw out of the sugar tax or soft drinks industry levy. First of all, to try and make it clear that firms don't pay taxes. So earlier we heard a talk from an MP, I was online, and he talked about industry paying its fair share and the polluter pays principle. So people pay taxes, not firms. Ultimately, it's going to be shareholders It could be employees, either through reductions in employment or reductions in wages, or it's going to be exactly what we've got there, consumers paying taxes through pass-through onto prices. So it doesn't matter if we levy the tax on the firm, ultimately some group of people are going to pay it. And so it's really worth thinking about who that is when you levy a tax in an industry such as this. Second thing, the soft drinks industry levy raised a lot less money than it was originally predicted to. That is because it worked. So among our reasons for taxing, in this case, raising revenue and behaviour change are in conflict. The more effective it is in terms of behaviour change, the less revenue it's going to raise. So we need to just keep that in mind. So what I thought I'd do is think about this framework and you know, context, in the context of gambling. So, will taxing gambling raise revenue? Yes, it will. Will it be redistributive? Well, yes, in the sense that public spending tends to be redistributive. And if you believe in hypothecation, then also we could say that particular portion of tax revenue will be spent directly on a particular public service. Will it change behaviour? Well, try and think it through. So if we were taking the examples we had before, where we varied the tax rate with the degree of harm that the product was causing, so a higher alcohol content product, we gave it a higher tax rate, what might we think about doing? So we could think about a higher tax rate on those forms of gambling that cause the most harm. So perhaps remote gambling, perhaps online slots, but as we heard earlier, if there was pass-through of the tax here, would people reduce their gambling behaviour? And if they did, what would they switch to? Would they switch to unregulated black market gambling instead? So even if we observed a reduction in behaviour in the one we're targeting, where's that spending going? Could we target high street premises? So there's some discussion just in other work that I know about using differential business rates, so perhaps targeting high street premises through differential business rates might be one way of going about this. So how might behaviour change arise? We think about behaviour change as arising through price changes. And as Jeff has just said, everyone entering the casino thinks they're smarter than the owner. For many people, price is not at all transparent. I'm an economist. What would I think price is of a bet? I'd think for £1, it's 1 minus the expected value of the bet. What will the company do if I tax it? It will change the odds that you face to try and pass the tax through to you, the consumer. And if you are not able to process the odds that you're facing, this is completely untransparent to you. It could be transparent. But then even if it is transparent, which groups will be responsive? The groups who will be responsive are exactly the groups that were just mentioned then. The casual gambler who doesn't have a problem but suddenly thinks, I'm not going to bet on that anymore because I'm only going to win 10p for every pound I place. I'm not going to do that. So the groups I think that are likely to be responsive are exactly the groups you are not targeting, and the groups you are targeting are the absolute least likely to be responsive because they have an addiction problem. That leads to concerns about regressivity, so you might then conclude that redistribution through this tax is unlikely. So the last two I've been told I'm out of time, the last 2 bullet points are super boring, but I did have a little look around at the different ways that countries tax and the different rates they employ, and I think as an economist, an empirical economist myself, I'd be interested in using that type of variation in tax rates and prices to think about whether we can learn anything about effects. And also some of the data that was mentioned earlier with regard to people's gambling behaviour, what I think of as consumer data, to try and learn something about what I'd super nerdily call the price elasticity of demand and how people respond to price changes from microdata on consumers. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. My undergraduate in economics got a really good refresher there. I'm a psychologist these days, perhaps for some reasons. So we have some fantastic questions already that have come through on the Slido. So feel free to add more through that. I think I might just crack straight into one or two of them because, yeah, I really like all the questions that have been asked. There's one that's come through for Emma. So Emma, are there any active steps Nationwide is putting into place to help block in-game transactions in video games, such as loot boxes, which often are linked to gambling activities?
It's a really interesting question, and I think plays on the point that the environment is constantly evolving. And that's what we heard through some of the other presentations. At the moment, our gambling block doesn't cover gaming because it's on merchant category codes. So that is merchant category codes of recognised UK gambling. There are loopholes to that, like everything. And so the gambling blocks are really effective for what they block, the merchant category codes. But for things beyond that, gaming is included, unrecognised or recognised but currently unrecognised in UK gambling merchant transaction codes. So I think the next phase of work, and again something that's emerged through the Gambling Harms Action Lab, is looking at how can we extend the efficacy of our blocks. How do we make sure they are covering what they should be covering? And I think I picked up from Andy's speech earlier around loopholes, then finding loopholes in current measures. So our gambling blocks are good, but they're not perfect. And gaming is one example of something that we can see gambling behaviours coming through, but are not currently recognised in gambling blocks.
Thank you. I guess the next question is kind of similar, but it, Nikki, Helen, or Jeff can also weigh in on it. So the questioner asks about the increasing tendency for gambling operators to also receive deposits in cryptocurrencies. So this is something that Ali presented on earlier. Is there anything that we can do here, or are we just sort of like persistently chasing an industry that's sort of more nimble and agile than we are?
It's a really good question, and I'm going to build off of what Emma said in terms of the evolving nature of it. I had a chat with Ali at lunchtime, and his thoughts on this was that you can't regulate. This is the unregulatable, and I think he made that clear in his speech. But I know that there are efforts going on at the FCA in this space around cryptocurrency, but it's certainly something a bit like your unregulated market that we're running behind in a whack-a-mole style. And there's solutions, and there's lots of conversations being discussed. There's different companies that have got solutions, but they're all pretty imperfect. And I think that's where, when we're thinking about intervening in this space, there is no one silver bullet in this. It's about a selection of tools that might support people, but we're going to continually be running behind technology, and I think that's the sad reality.
Very, very good perspectives, Nikki. I think I might just, I know Martin's got his hand up. I might just use, I guess, my chair's privilege to ask a question of my own that I feel has some relevance, perhaps to Jeff and perhaps to Helen. Obviously, any of you can weigh in. If we have twin goals, right, from regulating gambling, of raising taxation and also keeping customers safe, is there not an alternative option here in use in certain jurisdictions, such as Jeff's province, Quebec, where the gambling operator is actually government-run? So the government is getting the profits from the whole business, and is also directly able to put in harm prevention processes that they think might be effective. Jeff, have you got any thoughts on state-run gambling companies?
I think that it's an interesting question. I mean, in Quebec, the government is the owner, operator, regulator. So it's like the hen watching the chicken coop. And once a vice president of Lotto Quebec, which owns all the gambling in Quebec, said to me, Jeff, you know, we can increase our revenues dramatically, but we don't want to do that. We just want a slight increase. So the Minister of Finance goes to the president of Lotto Quebec at the end of each year and says, okay, we're setting our budget for next year. How much money are you going to give us? And so the owner-operator says, listen, we have to be careful, we have to be cautious, we have to be responsible. And so, yes, we could probably show you a slight increase. But we don't want to have a dramatic increase because, A, that'll become the new level for which they'll balance the budget for the following year. But at the same time, and this goes back to one of the questions that Helen said, or asked actually, about what happens when you increase tax revenues, will you change behavior? So Quebec, as an example, owns the lottery. And throughout Canada, they have something called the Maxi Lotto, which is right across the country, but each province operates it individually. They, at one point, said, you know what? It used to be $1, Canadian dollar. They said, let's make it $2. But what we'll do is we'll increase the prize that you can win. And what they found was that actually increased revenue. That more people were buying the $2 lotto than previously bought the $1 lotto. So I think we have to be kind of cautious. And I think we really have to, researchers have to keep their feet to the ground and keep the government responsible, especially in Quebec, about increasing their wagers, increasing the volume of gambling, increasing availability of gambling, and how we could develop prevention initiatives to minimize the harms associated with gambling.
Good point, Jeff. There is definitely no silver bullet here. Just wondering, Helen, if you've got any perspectives on this as an economist?
I don't know. I mean, I'm sort of, generally we're against monopolies as economists, but I mean, I just think practically, how would it work in a world where you can, I don't know how it works. You can be sat in Quebec, but you could be gambling online via a company anywhere in the world. So for me, it starts straying into the whole realms of, international taxation. Where are these companies located in order to avoid corporation tax? I think it's super complicated, and so it's practical for something like the National Lottery. It's practical for something like the Tote, if that's still government-owned. I don't know. But for an individual consumer with the immense choice where they could gamble via their phone. Right.
Yeah, there's definitely never any one silver bullet here in gambling harm prevention. I know, Martin, I've kept you waiting. I know you're desperate to give us your perspectives. Now is your time.
Thank you. First of all, I really empathised with the Darth Vader comment. I'll explain that to you later. A couple of quick points. This morning we heard about machine learning algorithms. We don't see much visibility of them in the public domain. That's kept within Gambling Commission and operators. But those we do see at suicide inquests inevitably have the operator saying, very sorry, our algorithm didn't pick it up. And I'll happily talk to anybody and explain why they're not very good. Spain has similar views of its operators' machine learning algorithm and has developed its own regulator's algorithm, which it is consulting on and is likely to impose that on its operators in due course. So question one is, have you seen that happening anywhere else? Second point, to the banking industry, and talking to Nick here through the conference, the banking industry has got a tremendous ability to inform the public debate on the extent of gambling harm. There was a snapshot survey by NatWest 3 or 4 years ago, which said something like 10% of our 750,000 current accounts are spending more than 25% on gambling merchant codes. So were they able to say, okay, we've screened our accounts and on an anonymous basis, X% are spending more than 10%, Y% are spending more than 25%, Z% are spending more than 50%, and were to repeat that monthly or quarterly, we could be able to see whether that amount of spend was getting worse or getting better, whether it's skewing left or skewing right. And if individual banks and building societies and or UK finance could collate that, we would have a virtually live sample of the extent of gambling harm rather than a periodic sample of 20,000 or less for which to determine scale of gambling harm. What are the chances of the social responsibility of the banking industry stepping up to the mark?
Shall I come in?
Do you want to go in?
Yeah. Yes, Martin, you were talking to me about that article last night, and I'm going to try and dig it out myself. I haven't come across it. But I think we've got the gambling survey for Great Britain, and we know the prevalence rates that are in there, but we know that all the methodological challenges with self-reporting and, how accurate those prevalence rates are is up for question. But one place that we can see much more, or a different set of data, I suppose, that doesn't rely on self-reporting is transaction data in banks. And there's a huge opportunity here. We've really started seeing some innovation in this space. Naomi Muggleton, academic, did some great work with Lloyds banking data a few years ago, really understanding what you can see from transaction data there. Behavioural insights team similarly have done some great work with other firms. But really for us, it feels like there's a real opportunity here, as we've got these 7 banks together, to think about how they can use their data and how we can share that, and are there opportunities for sharing that. So it feels a very ambitious ask, but I think it's a really good ask, and it's one that we should keep on the table, absolutely.
Okay, we've got a hand up here. We might have to be very brief, depending on how strict the Time Lords are. But do we have time for one more question, Vanessa?
Yeah. Is it me?
Oh, okay. Awesome.
I'm really interested in illegal money lending and payday loans and pawn shops, and what do you see in banking related to that?
Do you mean in terms of...
Are you seeing it in the transactions? Are you... I'm assuming illegal money lenders prefer cash, but the payday loans and pawn shops, do you track any of that? Because it's very closely aligned with what's happening on the high streets with gambling on the high streets. I'm assuming it's going to be the same whether they're gambling online or on the high streets, that they're using a lot of pawn shops, payday loans, etc.
Yeah, a lot of that is really difficult to track, and obviously there's limitations to what we can. We absolutely can if it's recognised through the merchant category codes, and this is where we've got some kind of gaps and limitations. There's also other loopholes you just mentioned there in terms of cash withdrawals, so a lot of that is within cash. And so we're looking at spending limits on ATM withdrawals, for example, which other banks have implemented. In terms of our data, we see net spend is where a lot of our kind of transactional data is around. We don't necessarily see returns. So there's all kinds of limitations and nuances, but we definitely probably have data in that space, I can imagine. It's just unpicking it all and making sure it is what we think it is and not indicative when we're reporting it.
Okay, thank you everyone. We're only able to scratch the surface there of so many important topics, and that just shows the richness and interesting side of these topics. But thank you to all of our panelists and our keynote speakers.
Thank you.